The steppe was silent, yet not with peace. Smoke crawled low across the horizon, curling like the breath of the dead. What the dawn revealed was not battle, but aftermath, 1,000 scattered bones gleaming beneath a pale Mongolian sun. The wind moved through them like a slow dirge, carrying the stench of ash, sweat, and rot across endless grasslands. Here, silence was not mercy. It was policy. For Genghis Khan, born as Temujin, silence meant control. In his empire, every whisper was measured, every heartbeat a declaration of loyalty or defiance. He had learned early that words could betray faster than swords, and so he built a world where fear spoke louder than language. History remembers him as a conqueror, the man who bent half the known world beneath the hoofbeats of Mongol horses. But behind that legend was something colder, more deliberate, a vision forged in pain. His childhood had been a prison of hunger, betrayal, and exile. He watched his father poisoned, his family cast out, his mother clawing at the frozen soil for roots to keep her children alive. It was in that desolation that he learned the law of survival, that mercy was not strength, it was invitation. And so, when power came to him, he gave it no softness. His army was a living storm, precise, disciplined, and trained to obey without hesitation. Yet their true weapon was not the bow or blade. It was terror. Before the Mongols ever arrived, cities surrendered at the sound of their name. Rumors rode faster than cavalry. Of rivers choked with corpses, of towns that vanished overnight, of rulers who begged for death before the Khan's judgment could reach them. He used fear not as punishment, but as architecture. Under his rule, cruelty was not chaos. It was order. Villages that resisted were obliterated, so that others might obey. The Mongols called it justice. To the conquered, it was apocalypse. And in that divide, Genghis found his throne, seated not upon gold, but upon obedience carved by terror. It began subtly. A messenger would ride ahead of the main force, unarmed, bearing only the Khan's seal. He would offer a choice, submission and tribute, or annihilation. Those who bowed lived under Mongol law. Those who refused were erased. The simplicity was surgical. No need for speeches, no need for negotiations. The fear did the work. But fear, once learned, demands demonstration. After the fall of Nishaper, legend tells that the city's resistance enraged the Mongol court. In retribution, the order was given that no living thing should remain. The earth itself was to forget the name of Nishaper. Whether the tale exaggerated or not, its purpose was clear. Horror as inheritance. Every survivor carried the story to the next city, and by the time the next gates opened, surrender had already begun. There was no randomness in his cruelty. His punishments followed patterns, rhythms, the choreography of submission. Captives were paraded before soldiers, their deaths orchestrated to teach obedience. Generals who disobeyed found their families erased. Even the loyal lived under the shadow of consequence. And yet, beneath the horror, there was an unsettling logic. The Khan's empire depended on unity across thousands of miles and countless tribes. Without fear, it would fracture. Without punishment, it would dissolve. He had built machine power by discipline, and terror was the oil that kept it running. Still, the cost was immeasurable. There are chronicles that describe his eyes as unblinking, almost glassy, a man who saw the world as landscape and law, never as faces. But behind that stare was the echo of his own captivity. In every punishment he decreed, there was a reflection of his past. The boy who had been humiliated, now ensuring no one would ever do the same to him again. Power had not freed him. It had crystallized his pain into empire. When his warriors rode into battle, their silence was more frightening than their war cries. They moved like shadows, efficient and wordless. Their captives often died without ever hearing a sentence pronounced upon them. Death itself was not the punishment. It was the uncertainty before it. The Mongols learned to weaponize expectation. They would release a few captives, maimed but alive, sent back to their cities to tell what they had seen. Fear multiplied faster than armies. Before the next conquest, submission already rippled to the land like wildfire through dry grass. To outsiders, it seemed barbaric. To Genghis, it was strategy, a way to spare his soldiers from needless battles. If terror could conquer what arrows could not, then terror was a higher wisdom. In his eyes, he was not cruel. He was efficient. But history rarely remembers intention. It remembers echo. And the echo of Genghis Khan's rule was one of bones, stacked in silence, bleaching under endless skies. His name, spoken centuries later, still carried the chill of finality. Yet there were moments, fleeting and almost human, when he spoke of peace. He dreamed of uniting all under one law, one banner. His code, the Yasa, forbade theft, upheld loyalty, and demanded justice even for the poor. He saw order as mercy, but his mercy was made of iron. For him, the world was a single step, boundless, harsh, impartial. In that world, compassion was weakness. Every punishment, every execution, every massacre served the same design, to make disobedience unthinkable. The empire expanded like a breath drawn too deep. From China to the Caspian Sea, cities fell, empires crumbled, and still the horizon did not end. But the wider his dominion grew, the thinner his control became. Fear could silence rebellion, but it could not silence memory. And beneath the grandeur of conquest, whispers began. Soldiers who once obeyed without question started to question in silence. Advisors muttered of excess. Even his own sons wondered if their father had crossed a line not set by gods or men, but by nature itself. It was then that the true paradox's reign emerged, that an empire built on terror must always feed it or die by it. Every act of cruelty demanded another to sustain its weight. Each victory deepened the shadow beneath it. By the time his armies reached the edges of Europe, the legend of Genghis Khan had already outpaced a man. To some, he was divine justice. To others, the devil on horseback. But perhaps the truth lay somewhere in between, in that gray expanse where fear and faith become indistinguishable. And so the silence continued, spreading further, heavier. Cities surrendered before the first arrow flew. Kings sent tribute before the first envoy arrived. The world bowed not to one man, but to the idea of him, an idea forged in the fires of cruelty and crowned with silence. But as the empire reached its zenith, a question lingered, faint but relentless. What happens when fear itself begins to hunger? What happens when even conquest is not enough? Somewhere beyond the steppe, in the stillness after the storm, the answer was waiting, in the instrument of silence yet to come. The night before punishment was always quiet. The Mongols believed noise diluted fear, and fear, when pure, was more powerful than any blade. In the dark camps of the empire, silence was not emptiness. It was waiting. Captives sat in that waiting, their wrists bound by rawhide, their faces turned toward the ground. The air was heavy with the smell of horse sweat, leather, and smoke. Above them, the moon hung thin and cold, reflecting in their hollow eyes like a second witness. Every man there had already seen what awaited him. They didn't need words. They had heard the stories. The stories were part of the punishment. Before the lash or the rope, before the flesh was even touched, the Mongols broke the mind. Their first cruelty was anticipation. They would force prisoners to watch, to smell, to imagine. A condemned man might spend 3 nights among the dying, hearing their slow collapse, learning the rhythm of suffering until his thoughts were no longer his own. When the time came for his own turn, his body was merely following a path his soul had already walked. Genghis Khan understood the power of this theater. To him, fear was performance, a ritual that demanded precision. Torture, when done without order, was wasteful. But when orchestrated with silence and spectacle, it became a tool of empire. Those who resisted Mongol rule were not always killed. Death could be too quick, too clean. Some were made examples, symbols of what it meant to defy the Khan. The punishment began not with blades, but with humiliation. Captives of noble birth were stripped of dignity, forced to crawl beneath the boots of their conquerors, sometimes used as footstools for the Khan's generals during council. A prince reduced to furniture. That was a clearer message than any decree. The Mongols called it the lowering. It was a ceremony of inversion, where status was unmade and pride became a spectacle. No blood was spilled, but something deeper was destroyed, identity. Even among the Mongols themselves, discipline was absolute. If a soldier abandoned his post, stole a horse, or disobeyed an order, The punishment was swift and cold. Sometimes it was a public beating. Sometimes it was worse. The condemned would be bound and left in the steppe overnight, naked beneath the freezing wind, surrounded by wolves. If he survived until dawn, it was said the spirits had forgiven him. Most did not. These punishments weren't cruelty for its own sake. They were lessons written in flesh. Every man in Genghis Khan's army had seen them. Every man understood. Fear was the law. Obedience was life. But there was one punishment that spoke of deeper calculation, the smothering. Among the Mongols, it was forbidden to shed the blood of nobles or royal prisoners. Blood, they believed, carried spirit. To spill it was to offend heaven. And so they learned to kill without blood. Those condemned of noble rank were wrapped in felt carpets, their limbs bound tight. Horses were made to trample them, slowly, methodically, until breath and bone collapsed beneath silence. It was a death without a drop of red, but the sound, the dull crush of ribs under hooves, haunted even the executioners. In that soundless violence lay the essence of Mongol justice, efficient, sacred, and absolute. Yet for Genghis Khan, even that was not enough. Torture had to speak, not through screams, but through memory. He devised forms of punishment that left survivors alive, but altered, marked by terror they would carry home. These men became living messengers. Their broken bodies told stories far louder than words. In one account from the Western campaigns, captives were tied together with rope and left in the desert. No food, no water, only the sun and each other. By the second day, madness set in. Some begged for death. Others tried to chew through the ropes with cracked teeth. By the third, only a few still moved. When Mongol scouts returned, they released one and sent him limping toward his homeland, a parable of what awaited defiance. It was cruelty made systematic. Pain was currency, traded for obedience. But within that darkness, a paradox took shape. Genghis Khan's laws, his yasa, forbade theft, adultery, and deceit. They promoted loyalty, protected the weak, demanded fairness in trade. To those who obeyed, the Khan was just. To those who resisted, he was apocalypse. The same man who rewarded discipline with gold would crush rebellion with silence. To him, both acts were justice, two halves of a single truth. He saw the world as order and chaos. Those who served him lived within the circle of order. Those who opposed him existed outside it and had to be erased. In this vision, torture became purification, a means to cleanse the empire of disorder. But to those beneath the whip, order felt no different than madness. The empire's reach grew, and so did the demand for spectacle. The more distant the borders stretched, the more terrible the punishment became, as if cruelty itself had to travel faster to keep pace with conquest. Fear had to stay ahead of the horses. Genghis Khan often watched from a distance, expressionless, as prisoners were punished. His face, described by chroniclers, betrayed neither pleasure nor disgust. It was a gaze of a man who saw pain as arithmetic, a necessity, not indulgence. When he spoke, it was rarely of pity, but of efficiency. A trembling enemy, he once said, does not hold a sword. And yet there were nights, rare whispered nights, when he rode alone beyond the fires, toward the empty plains. Some said he prayed. Others said he spoke to no one. The man who made the world bow still carried within him the silence of childhood, the years when he, too, had been powerless. Perhaps that silence guided his hand more than vengeance ever could. The instruments of silence were not only ropes and rugs, pits and frost. They were the tools by which he reshaped humanity, teaching obedience through terror, faith through survival. His punishments did not merely end lives. They rewrote meaning. Under his reign, to live was not to be free. It was to obey. And yet, in that obedience lay the seed of something darker. As fear spread across continents, the question that once haunted his enemies began to haunt his own people. How long could silence rule before it devoured its master? The Khan's empire stood vast and gleaming under the steppe sun, but beneath its surface, the air began to crackle with quiet unease. The same silence that had once built his power now began to echo differently, hollow, endless, uncertain. What began as order was slowly becoming its opposite. And as his empire swelled to the edges of the world, the man who had mastered fear would soon learn the truth of it, that silence, once unleashed, obeys no one. Morning broke without color. The light over the steppe was pale, drained, as if the sun itself refused to witness what men had become. The Mongol camp stirred in its precise rhythm. Soldiers feeding horses, armor glinting faintly in the chill air, smoke rising from dung fires. Somewhere beyond those fires, prisoners waited for judgment. The empire of silence was about to speak again, this time through flesh. By then, Genghis Khan's rule had grown beyond borders, beyond resistance. Yet his power, bound by fear, demanded constant renewal. Each conquest had to be sharper than the last, each punishment more absolute. Conquest was no longer enough. It had to be believed, remembered, felt. The morning's ritual began with the condemned, 6 men accused of betrayal. Their faces were burned by wind and war, their eyes dull with exhaustion. Around them, soldiers stood in still formation, the air heavy with dust and tension. The prisoners had not been told their fate. That uncertainty was part of the ritual. At the center of the clearing stood the instruments, boards of thick timber, ropes, and coarse felt rugs. Nothing elaborate, nothing ceremonial. The Mongols did not ornament death. They refined it. The first man was brought forward. His name, the chroniclers say, was lost to time. He might have been a prince, a thief, or merely a witness who had seen too much. It did not matter. In the empire of Genghis Khan, guilt was measured by necessity. If fear demanded an example, then someone must become it. The punishment was called crushing beneath the boards. The condemned was laid face down, bound tight, and wooden planks were placed upon his back. Gradually, weight was added. Stones and men, then beams, until the ribs began to bow, the lungs compressed, and the world narrowed to one long, soundless breath. There was no scream, only the small, broken noise of breath trying to exist where it no longer could. The soldiers watched without flinching. To them, this was not cruelty. It was ceremony, the reaffirmation of order. Each collapse of bone was a note in the song of empire. When the body finally stilled, the weight remained. No one removed it. The lesson was not for the dead, but for the living. The next prisoner was bound beneath a rug of felt. The law forbade the spilling of noble blood. So this death was made bloodless. Horses were driven over the bound form, hooves thudding rhythmically like drums of war. Dust rose. Silence followed. When the rug was unrolled, there was no man, only the shape of one, pressed flat into memory. These punishments were not inventions of madness. They were instruments of design. To Genghis Khan, each death was a message carved into history. His terror was not random but disciplined, a language spoken in agony, understood in submission. Even his generals feared him. Once, a commander named Jeeb disobeyed a direct order. He returned victorious, his conquest successful, but his defiance unforgiven. The Khan's judgment was cold. You have won too freely. Jeeb's life was spared, but his sons were executed, a reminder that victory without obedience was still failure. In the chronicles of his campaigns, there are passages describing boiling oil and burning sand, punishments reserved for spies, deceivers, and oath-breakers. The condemned were bound in clay pots filled with oil, heated slowly until the body surrendered breath by breath. Yet even this, the chroniclers note, was done with purpose. The Khan did not kill to revel in suffering. He killed to instruct. His cruelty was mathematical. If one death could prevent 10 rebellions, then mercy was treason. The central conflict of his reign lay not between Mongol and enemy, but between power and conscience. Each act of torture deepened his control, yet chipped away at his humanity. The man who once sought unity now ruled by division, dividing life from dignity, obedience from soul. There are accounts of his men burying captives alive in the foundations of new cities, believing their spirits would guard the walls against rebellion. To the Mongols, this was a sacred offering. To history, it became a symbol of how belief itself can turn monstrous when it kneels before power. But even among the Mongols, unease grew. The same men who once gloried in conquest began to avert their eyes. The veterans who had followed him from the beginning now spoke in murmurs when his name was mentioned. They had seen too much. The slow deaths, the hollow stares, the weight of silence settling like ash over their souls. And somewhere within that silence, a question began to whisper, not to the soldiers, but to their leader. Was fear still a weapon, or had it become a wound? In his tent, beneath banners dyed in conquest, Genghis Khan sat alone. The firelight flickered against his armor, illuminating a face carved by years and ghosts. He was not a man drunk on cruelty. He was a man haunted by it. The empire he had built from vengeance now demanded vengeance from him in return. Every rebellion crushed, every doubt silenced, every act of mercy punished by consequence. He had become both the savior and the curse of his own design. Outside, the executions continued. A soldier miscounted supplies and was whipped until he could not stand. Another was accused of theft and bound to a stake in the cold, left for the night wind to finish. There was no malice in it, only procedure. The empire had become a machine, and pain was its rhythm. And yet, for all its precision, something was slipping. The farther his armies rode, the thinner his grasp became. The terror that once united now began to scatter. Too wide, too deep. New lands yielded tribute, but their people obeyed out of distance, not devotion. Fear can command, but it cannot hold. In that realization lay the beginning of decay. The Khan had subdued half the world, but he could not conquer the silence within his own heart. The same silence that once strengthened him now echoed hollow. He had taught millions to kneel, but could not teach himself to rest. And still, the punishments continued. Ritual, repetition, necessity. Each act intended to preserve the empire only deepened its shadow. Each scream buried in dust became another ghost whispering through the steppe winds. The chroniclers say he slept little in his final years. When he did, he dreamed of rivers running red and faces without eyes. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was prophecy. Perhaps it was the sound of history turning against its maker. For every empire built on cruelty, there comes a moment when the instruments of fear turn inward. When the torturer hears, at last, the echo of his own voice in the cries of others. That echo was beginning to sound. And as the Mongol armies rode toward their next campaign, their leader watched the horizon, a vast, endless void. Beyond it lay more conquests, more blood, more silence. But deep within him, something began to fracture, the faint realization that the empire he built on terror could never know peace. The flesh had screamed, the bones had broken, the world had bowed. Yet even as his enemies fell, the true rebellion was beginning, not in the cities he burned, but in the conscience he could no longer silence. The steppe stretched endless beneath a cold sky, a vast silence unbroken by wind or war. Genghis Khan sat at its center, a man surrounded by everything he had conquered and haunted by everything he had lost. The empire he had forged from blood and fire now glimmered like a distant mirage, powerful yet fragile, magnificent yet hollow. What began as unity through strength had become an empire of shadows, where obedience was bought with silence and peace was kept by fear. He was no longer the young warrior named Temujin, hungry and defiant. He was Genghis Khan, the world's master and its prisoner. The faces of his enemies no longer haunted him. It was the faces of his own men, his sons, his generals, his victims, that lingered in the quiet. Their voices, once silenced by command, had begun to echo through the corridors of his thoughts. He rode alone often now, leaving the camps at dawn to follow the ghost trails of his youth. The horizon he had once chased for conquest now seemed like judgment. Each hoofbeat against the frostbitten soil carried memories of the first tribe he united, the first rebellion he crushed, the first scream that proved his law absolute. Yet beneath those victories lay an unspoken truth. Every act of cruelty had carved away a piece of his soul until there was almost nothing left but will. The Khan's law, the yasa, had been meant as order, a code of justice in a world of chaos. It forbade theft, demanded loyalty, honored the weak, and punished deceit. But as the years stretched and his empire expanded, the yasa had become a reflection of its maker. Fair in words, merciless in practice. What was once a path to unity became a doctrine of fear. Even within his court, the balance began to falter. His sons, born into power, had not known the hunger that had shaped him. They saw conquest as inheritance, not burden. They questioned his punishments, his silence, his relentless campaigns. To them, the empire was secure. To him, security was illusion. One son urged peace, another sought glory, a third whispered a mercy. And for the first time, Genghis Khan hesitated. The man who had never feared a sword now feared weakness in his own blood. That was the curse of empire, that its first victim was always its creator. As the campaigns continued westward, resistance grew more desperate. Cities surrendered, yet rebelled again. Fear that once conquered now began to harden into hatred. The Khan's name, once spoken with trembling awe, was whispered with venom. To the Mongols, he was divine. To the conquered, he was the shadow that devoured the sun. In Bokhara, it was said he stood before the great mosque and declared to the trembling faithful, "If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Whether the words were his or born of legend, they captured the truth of how he saw himself. Not as a man of cruelty, but as a weapon of destiny. Yet destiny is never kind to its tools. The empire had become a living contradiction, built in the name of peace, sustained by violence. Every punishment he ordered was meant to preserve harmony, but each one only deepened the wound. The silence he had once used to control now began to consume. It stretched between him and his people, between his will and their understanding. Even his generals, men who had marched beside him for decades, began to sense the weight of the stillness that surrounded their leader. He could command a world, but not the quiet within himself. One night, the story goes, he entered his tent and ordered all torches extinguished. The guards obeyed, leaving him in complete darkness. There, beneath the black canvas of sky and soul, he spoke aloud to no one, or perhaps to everything. He had conquered nations, erased cities, tamed chaos itself. Yet he could not conquer the ghosts that followed him. The boy who had been powerless, the son who had watched his father die, the man who mistook vengeance for justice. For a moment, the conqueror felt small again, not divine, not eternal, just human and unbearably alone. The next morning, he rose before dawn. The air was brittle, the ground frosted white. He rode to the edge of camp and watched the horizon, where the steppe faded into the faint outline of mountains. Behind him, his empire waited, armies ready to ride, laws ready to strike, punishments ready to be carried out. But before him lay something greater than conquest, the emptiness of what he had created. He had united the tribes, built an empire of law, crushed rebellion and treachery, and carved his name into eternity. But history's cruelest irony is that it never preserves what one intends. The same terror that had built his throne will become the story that survived him. The chronicles will remember his victories, his discipline, his unmatched strategy. But they would also whisper the punishments that went too far, of the smothered nobles, the crushed bodies, the deserts filled with bones. They would call him both savior and monster, emperor and executioner. In truth, he had been all of these. The conflict that had driven him all his life, order against chaos, unity against betrayal, could never truly be won. Because every empire, no matter how vast, eventually turns inward. Its walls, once built to keep fear out, become its own prison. As his health began to wane, Genghis Khan spoke less. Those closest to him noticed a change, a quiet weariness that hung between his words. He no longer sought war for glory, but for completion. Perhaps he believed that one more conquest might silence the ghosts. Perhaps he knew they never would. The chronicles say he died on campaign, still chasing victory. Some claim he was killed by an arrow, others that he fell from his horse. But perhaps it was something quieter that ended him. The weight of silence itself. The same silence he had wielded as a weapon, now turned inward, sealing his legacy in stillness. When his body was carried across the steppe for burial, no one spoke of his tomb's location. His grave was hidden, his servants killed to preserve the secret. The empire that had once echoed with his name now shrouded it in silence, as if the earth itself sought to forget. Yet forgetting was impossible. His shadow had already become part of the world's spine. The laws he wrote, the roads he built, the fear he inspired, they endured long after the man was gone. In the centuries that followed, his name would grow beyond history, into myth, into warning. His story would remind the world that power without mercy becomes its own undoing, that the line between God and monster is drawn not in blood, but in silence. And somewhere beneath the endless Mongolian sky, the wind still carries its echo, a whisper that trembles through the grass, soft yet unrelenting. It asks a question older than empire, older than war. What does it mean to rule the world if you cannot rule yourself? And the steppe answers, as it always has, with silence,